This is Synopsis, a series of conversations in the framework of Abeceda Institute. I'm Neža Zupanc, and with me today is Max Gibson. Max, welcome, and please a couple of words of introduction.
Hi, Neža. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I'm Max Gibson. I'm a composer, sound artist, researcher, educator, community practitioner. I kind of occupy all these different realms and enjoy the diversity and kind of the madness of moving between them. I'm currently a student at UC Davis, where I'm doing a PhD in composition and theory, but I'm also pursuing these like weird orbits around that of science and technology studies and environmental humanities and bringing that into my work. So that's where I am at the minute.
Can we start here, perhaps? What is the subject of the thesis you're working on right now?
Sure. It always starts and then you have a frog in the throat. So the approach to PhDs in the States is a little different because you start with coursework and then you build on a thesis once you've kind of done the coursework. But I am currently in the process of writing that. And you do a written document, which is more kind of analytical, and you do a composition side. And I'm looking at the ways, or thinking about looking at the ways, certain composers in the 20th century had a very different relationship with technology, and so technology was not just a tool, but actually became something that they co-collaborated with, thinking of technologies that really resist control or resist kind of being able to be mastered. I think the kind of most fun one you could think of here is like modular synthesizers. Like it's kind of impossible to fully master a synth, but and you can think of the networks, the cables as being these massive networks in which you collaborate with. And so I'm looking at three composers in particular and thinking about the ways in which that co-collaboration with technology engenders different types of listening and care. And care is kind of the crux of what I'm really interested in. It's like what in musical practice turns into a practice of care. And so I'm still figuring out what all of that means, but that's what I'm interested in. I'm at the beginning of it.
You can speak more to why care.
So I suppose growing up, I was always around different types of care. So sometimes it was like health related, sometimes it was certain family members who needed looking after in certain ways, whether it's due to age or other things. And also growing up, like one of the core values for me was listening. And I think there's this really interesting tension that arises in the world of composition where it's very much focused on like genius expression. And not always, obviously, but I think, there is this kind of dominant narrative of like the composer as being the vessel for all knowledge and like kind of what they say goes. And I'm slightly getting more interested in practices that are open, inviting, collaborative, and I think that's related to like I was always encouraged to listen more so than act as a kid, and I feel like this has like stayed with me as this really interesting space, and of course musicians are always listening, but I think there's different types of listening, and so it's kind of it comes from like a synthesis or an assemblage of all these different things working together. And also thinking about practices and also social movements in the 20th century, especially where, with the 1960s, with various, civil rights, feminism, queer rights, like all of that starts to fracture practice. So practice across all the arts decides to go in different directions because of the social movements which are happening at the time. And I'm obviously very, very much kind of rooted in histories of the UK and histories of the US, just because of where my localities are. But I think the ways in which a lot of events then, and also from then onwards, like the Vietnam War, for instance, there's this kind of huge global implication for a lot of this. And I think practice fractures afterwards. And so you have people who continue the narrative of before, and you have people who start to find alternative ways of being and living. That really interests me, because it's like, well, the current realm of the world isn't working. So like, what other pathways are there that could help us build worlds that are otherwise? And so I think looking at composers two of the composers I'm looking at really start their practice in kind of around the 60s, and one composer much later. But I think looking at them as this point of social upheaval, as it were, in music, just creates an interesting perspective. Yeah. And then I think on the creative side of the... Oh, sorry.
Sorry, please go.
I was going to say, because the dissertation is in two parts. So like the creative side of it, I'm very much going to be engaging with technologies that I don't know how to use yet, but I'm interested in building a relationship with. And so turning to those as co-collaborators and learning the language and developing something. Don't know what that something is. I don't want to have preordained ideas of that, but building something, a relationship with the technology is an interesting perspective for me to go down, rather than... I think this all comes from the piano. So the piano, I've had this really interesting, a few like interactions around the piano that have really changed my perspective about it. And one of them is with one of my composition teachers at Davis, and he calls it the tyranny of the piano, which is, it makes the piano sound terrifying, but I don't think it is. But it's this idea that like, once the piano was invented, all Western classical music situated itself around the piano. Everything had to be tuned to the piano, in terms of thinking about equal temperament and stuff like that. And so like, it has such a dominant narrative. And uh-oh. Hello.
Next, hi, I lost you for a couple of seconds.
Okay.
Sorry, but yes, I think we can just continue. I lost you at the how. This completely threw me out. Sorry. The dominant narrative
Of the piano. Okay.
of the piano. Yes. I'm so sorry. Could you pick it up from there? I think something happened with the signal.
Sure.
And I think it's still recording.
I heard it say recording stop, but
Yes,
maybe it is.
but it's going. I think
Okay, awesome.
we can just continue where we were left. I'm so sorry.
No problem.
Dominant narratives of the piano, and what you were mentioning, your teacher.
Yeah, so he has this idea of like the tyranny of the piano.
Yes.
And the ways in which the piano, once it's invented, particularly like the pianoforte, once it's invented, like everything orients itself around the piano within Western classical music. And we have this, everybody has to tune to it. Equal temperament becomes the dominant form, if not the only form, for a really long time. And then obviously people later are figuring out ways out of that. And then there's this really, really interesting article called Towards the Musicology of Interfaces by Emily Dolan. And it also talks about like the ways in which keyboards, we have this obsession with control through keyboards. and the ways in which like synthesizers that were made in the 20th century that didn't have a keyboard were less commercially successful because you couldn't control them as well, you know. And so like all of this has really changed my perspective about thinking about the piano and thinking about how composition works and how to music with each other. And I think this also comes from like interest in musics that do not use equal temperament. And so like how to either use the piano in a certain way or how to move away from the piano are also parts of that project.
Is piano your primary instrument? Yes.
Yeah.
So you studied piano before for how many years? How did that?
I started piano when I was 7, and so
So for
that
many
was
years.
25 years ago, yeah.
25 years. Are you still active as a pianist?
So more recently I've actually swapped to harpsichord. So I have harpsichord lessons at Davis, and it's become, I wouldn't say my main instrument, but it is the instrument that I play the most at the minute.
Oh, I see. Okay. So you are continuing your instrument practice all throughout also your compositional years of education. I see.
Yeah, I had a small gap where I didn't play,
Mm-hmm.
but it felt empty,
Mm.
and so I just needed I feel like the tactility of the instrument, the hearing sound, just being a musician is such a central part to being a composer for me. Like I
Mm-hmm.
can't not engage in some musical practice.
Yeah.
Um, when I was at I did my master's at Wesleyan, and there I didn't play piano really all that much, but I took organ lessons, and I was also part of the gamelan, and that opened up another
I
world.
remember the gamelan for Abettina, yeah. Right, this was a couple of years ago already.
It was, yeah.
Um, okay, so in the PhD, uh, and this is just to restate and make sure I understand. One part, as I understand it, deals with technology, electronic instruments, technology, and control of them. And there's also the other part, which sounds more sociological, more relevant. Or please tell me, is it a correct? How do you see that? And further from that, um, is is one of your interests? You mentioned control of the modular synthesis. Um, in my experience as well, always when that was in the game, it was a lot of risk. It was we don't really know what's going to happen. So I'm curious, are you making a step towards more control, acquiring more control there? And also, when you speak about control, is it you mentioned it in connection to tyranny. So my question is, is control good or bad here, or uh, you know, in quote unquote, and isn't it in every instrument that we strive to gain ultimate control as performers?
Yeah, that's a really rich question or set of questions.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. I'll answer the first one about the just kind of clarifying the project. I have, I'm not an anthropologist, but I have training in, I've taken a lot of anthropological courses. And so I think, as well as ethnomusicology, and so I think I'm always situating practice with people, and because it creates a much more interesting story, I think. And so, yeah, I sociological, anthropological. There's this social science element to it,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. And I think that and some of the things I'll be doing for that will include interviews and going to like doing field work in terms of visiting studios and things like that. And so there is this element of the people aspect that's very much part of it. To speak to control, there's always a value system with control, I think, and there is this automatic idea that, or there can be this automatic idea that control is a good thing or a bad thing. I don't necessarily think of it as good or bad. I think I'm really interested in the space of otherwise. And so composer, Pauline Oliveros, Eliane Radigue, they're working with technologies in a way that isn't about control, and it is about something else. And that something else is what interests me. I don't think the project is a way to get more control. I don't think it's like, I finally mastered the synthesizer, as great as that would be in terms of understanding how it works. I'm not so interested in that kind of mastery. I'm interested in what the instrument offers, as much as the composer or me as a musician. And again, it's not to say that control's a bad thing, because you're absolutely right. Like, people strive to have total mastery of their instruments. And I think there's a sort of interesting thread where when we try to think otherwise, it means trying to build a history or build a narrative that is perhaps far different from the one that exists. And again, that doesn't mean to say that the one that exists is a bad thing, but it's that was a very enjoyable low sound. I don't know whether,
outside.
Yeah. I think part of this is influenced by Donna Haraway, who talks about the cyborg. So in her manifesto, the Cyborg Manifesto, she writes about this idea that the cyborg is this space where organic and machine come together, and we are all cyborg in some form, but the cyborg also resists these binaries. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We're like our hands are like developing to the same shape as our phones,
And our backs. Yeah.
She offers it as a critique, but also as a benefit. Like, that is just the way our world has gone. But she has all this other discourse about how it resists the binaries that we've kind of built in our worlds of like good or bad, or male and female, or organic or inorganic, for instance. And so it starts to make this dominant narrative a bit more wobbly, and other things come out of it or diverge from it. And I think that's what I'm interested in. It's like, what are the diversions? What are the fracture points that, yeah, there are these amazing people who have spent so much time mastering their instruments, and that is incredible. But there could also be these other pathways. Some people might say amateur musicking, for instance, which is certainly one, but there are others.
What? I didn't understand it.
Amateur musicking.
So amateur musicking.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which is like really big in the UK, for instance.
Is musicking different than playing music in some?
It's the same thing.
It's the same. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. No. I'm like so indoctrinated with academia. There's a guy called Christopher Small who wrote a whole book called Musicking, and it's
okay. Sometimes it's also just a language barrier for me, so bear with me.
No. But it's pretty cool because he writes about like, it's not just like this structure of composer, performer, audience. It's actually in the musicking situation, everybody is a participant in this thread. and that interests me as well. Like I think history has dictated that we have these structures that are like the composer with all the information, the performer who conveys that information, you know. But actually, I think listeners have as much agency as everybody else. Listeners create music as much as the composer does. And so that's where the listening interest comes into. Which is why I think someone like Pauline Oliveros again is interesting because of deep listening. Yeah, I'll just ramble.
The goal of these conversations is to shed light on compositional practice, and whatever we can speak of that gets us there is welcome. And continuing, where do you see so we were now going from the angle of what you're working on in your PhD. I don't want to assume nothing, so I ask, where do you see the, let's say, origin, your own, let's say, your compositional practice? Sometimes that's very different than what one works on in a PhD. Sometimes it's the same thing. So where do you see your compositional practice there?
That's definitely something I'm figuring out at the minute. I think I come from a point. I've always thought of my points as being like a synthesis of the kind of the experimental tradition and this avant-garde modernism that I feel like permeates through all of contemporary music history as probably the main narrative. And I'm trying to kind of squash them together and make something that I like from both. And so I say things like that, and then I listen to my music and I'm like, oh, like it's there. All the influence is there. All the things that I'm interested in are there. But I think what it eventually sounds like is actually something otherwise from those traditions. And so like I've always been this, the simplest thing is I've always been interested in melody and line. And so I feel like this has connections to much earlier music than anything in the 20th century. And there's a sort of there's a really an obsession there with line for me, like this joy of just finding one single line and then trying to find another line that goes with it. Obviously that's counterpoint, but like it's such a simple compositional task, but it remains fascinating and beautiful.
Before you said counterpoint, I already was doubting your pianism, One line from the piano. Okay, sorry, jokes aside. But yeah, so line and counterpoint.
And it's just this kind of ongoing fascination that surfaces in really different ways, but I feel like is always there in my work. And in some ways that exists in both of those traditions, but I feel like I'm extending it back much further, and I'm using those traditions to find ways to maybe kind of not reinvent, because I don't think what I'm doing is reinventing, but ways to kind of energize and charge these age-old traditions, My favorite music is Baroque music. So like
that's why the harpsichord.
Kind of, yeah. I've always been fascinated by it. I did have like 2 harpsichord lessons during my undergrad, but the teacher was quite mean, and so I didn't want to have any more harpsichord lessons. But I have a teacher at Davis who's lovely, and is like has introduced me to lots of different musics that I think really have changed how I think about line as well, because so much early Baroque music is what's on the page and what happens are so different.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's got me really thinking about contemporary practice and what are the ways in which we communicate with our notations? What are the ways in which players have more agency, um, or not? Depending on what you want as a composer. Um, and so, for me, again, it's always this kind of I think a few years ago at the institute, like I was talking about pluralism and like I'm really interested in lots of different practices, and I think that's still the case. But I think I've just figured out what are the more main core points, and one of them is line and counterpoint. Again, it's such a simple, basic thing, but it's so cool.
Mm-hmm.
It's fun to be obsessed about.
Certainly. What would be the other ones then?
Um, Density is something I've always been interested in. Um, and so which obviously can lean into counterpoint, but I also think like the saturation of a single harmony, for instance, another form of density, um, which you see throughout the 20th century, but you see it in like Wagnerian scores. Um, I feel like Bach is full of density. It's kind of as a concept, what can you do with density? And so like sound massing or walls of sound. These are really interesting things to me. So people like Phil Niblock, I'm really inspired by because it's just wall of microtonal sound, which is fascinating. And I think one of the things I often explore in composition is using sound densities as a structural point. And so, like, what leads to a density, or what leads away from it, or is that the high point of a piece, or is density like the core sound world that you then move away from at one point? I think density becomes a really important part of practice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Perhaps we can go to how did you actually begin with composition?
Cool.
But before that, also in terms of density, could you offer an example, one of your works, and how you worked with that as a structure, for example?
Yeah. Let's see. There's an excerpt that I've sent
Yes.
um, from a piece called "Bread and Butter, Bones and Nutters on the River Styx."
Yes.
I like these kind of fun titles, and titles are important to me as well, and that's maybe something
Mm-hmm.
else we can talk about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but the the whole piece operates in like waves of density, so it starts very tumbrel, very like airy, and so it's very sparse in terms of density. Like it's very light, but there's these push points, and then there's one moment. It's really like a typical two-thirds of the way through. It has a climax,
Mm-hmm.
um, but at that climax, I'm really interested in the ways in which density works, not just as a sonic mass, but also as a stretching or as a pulling.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens is all of the instruments, um, it's a Piero ensemble, um, they're kind of really adding to this density of texture. But because the tempo is pulling, I think it's something like from quarter equals 72 to quarter equals 20 by the end. And so, like, it's so slow,
That's
but you
very slow.
feel,
That's
yeah.
that's like you barely can perceive it. So.
Uh-huh. Yeah, exactly. But because it's stretched so much, like every sound becomes even thicker in a way, because it has to hold on for that bit longer. Because it's like, and oh, is now the next beat? Yeah, there it is. And so it's kind of this mush of density too. Um, and that's something I'm exploring a lot is density in relation to tempo and the ways in which tempo can become very large compositional acts, whether
Mm-hmm.
that's speeding up or slowing down. Um, I've just finished a piece for soprano and bassoon where they have to speed up to the point where they actually break apart from one another. It's this line that repeats and repeats and repeats, and it becomes quite frantic. Um, and it's going from like the lowest range of the soprano up as like these waves. I think a lot in waves. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and it speeds up to this point where they break apart, but then it also slows down where it becomes really delivered and like accented. And so when it's delivered and accented, it doesn't feel particularly dense. But when you've got this flurry of information that breaks apart because of tempo, um, again, it becomes quite interesting um,
Mm-hmm.
because it's not just sonic mass. There's
Yeah.
something else happening with it.
So the listeners of this conversation can hear one of the density points at the very beginning, right? It's one of the
Mm.
denser points, I assume, what you sent. The
It is,
exer
yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Um, Further, to just a little bit before the reading of the scores, when you were mentioning Baroque, I wanted to ask how, when you say how different it was, then it's written. Um, do you work with that as a composer as well? Or how do you see that in your practice? I noticed that um, when working with an ensemble or uh, instrumentalists, practitioners on the regular basis, uh, let's say in my compositional practice, there tends to be more and more of the unwritten, uh, almost rules,
Mm.
basically. Um, how do you, where does your interest there lie? And especially on the base of your practice.
Yeah. Um, do you mean like written rules where like there's more performance directions than there are score kind of thing?
Uh, More the so you use a notation system. However, anyway, there's a lot of um, unwritten things that will happen. Perhaps they will be different where I am than where you are, because of slightly or very different culture of performance. So that's what I'm asking you about. This is that a part of your interest, and if yes, how and what do you see there?
So it's funny you should say that because thank you for clarifying because that helped. Um, because I I feel like I'm splitting my practice at the minute across three different spaces. One is the US, one is the UK, and I'm trying to get more involved with continental Europe. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think 2 summers ago there was a piece performed. Second performances are always really interesting, especially when they're with different ensembles, because you
Mm-hmm.
get such a different perspective on your piece and like what people are interested in and what people read and how they interpret things. Um, and I think two experiences of having two different pieces performed by different ensembles has really, I wouldn't say it's like a concern of my practice, but it has really made me think about it more. So I had one piece performed. I'm not going to name ensemble names or anything, but I had one piece performed in Davis, and then I had that same piece workshopped in Austria, and both performances, both renditions were great. Like both did a great job, but the kinds of questions I got from the Austrian ensemble
Mm-hmm.
um, versus the nature of how they engaged at Davis was like fascinating
Hmm.
because at Davis, they just came in and they kind of played it, and it was good. We fixed a few things. There were some questions. The score was pretty much interpreted how I thought it would be interpreted. Um, and then in Austria, the ensemble read it, and they were asking questions that I was like, oh damn, I don't even like. I've not really thought about that. But they were exceptional questions, and it really changed how I thought about stuff. But it was something as simple as like molto vibrato, you know. Give that to the Davis group, they would just do some version of molto vibrato as an interpretation. The group that workshopped it in Austria were like, no, what kind of molto vibrato? Is it this kind of vibrato? Is it that kind of vibrato? Is it this type of movement from this pitch to that pitch? Is it? And I was like, oh my God, that's like such a level of detail that I find inspirational to think with, but something I don't necessarily want to put in my score as being that precise.
Multi-vibrato.
Molto? My Italian's terrible.
Molto.
Molto.
Okay. Okay, I was already thinking there's something, there's a new technique, I don't know it. Okay. Okay, great. Also molto, yeah. Okay, what speed, what height you want. Yeah. I get it. Yeah, I see. So yeah, because and that's the curious part, right? Because even though you didn't think about it, you probably actually knew what you knew what you want. I bet, or heard your version of it. So
Yeah, because the player gave me like 3 or 4 different options, and I knew exactly from the ones that she played like which one I wanted. But it was the question itself was like I hadn't thought about how much detail you could actually give for that. I'm also from a tradition where I'm not sure whether you feel this way or not, but like I'm from a tradition where I don't want to be crazy hyper specific because I do want to invite the performer into that space to have some form of expression with it. I don't have a problem with practices or composers that do that, who want the hyper precision, but like it's just not for me. Like I'm not so interested in like every articulation, every and I think that's where Baroque music again is really interesting, especially the early Baroque, because you've got nothing on a page, and especially with harpsichord, articulation is everything, and how you go through articulation is really how you create the piece, even though it's the notes there kind of thing. And I feel like there's perhaps analogs with like groups like New Simplicity, where as long as certain things are there, the performer has a lot of agency around it. And I think I'm much more interested in that world than being super hyper precise. But that being said, like learning harpsichord and learning about articulation changed how I thought about articulation. Because on the piano, you shove the pedal down and you're like, it's great, it just sustains. I don't have to worry about anything. And then harpsichord is like, as soon as you let go, everything is naked and bare. And it's like, oh my God, I really have to think about articulation because it's really what makes the music, which sounds strange because it's like, well, no, the notes make the music, or the harmonies or the rhythms. On harpsichord, I really feel like it's articulation, because if articulation is kind of weird or wrong, not wrong because there's so many ways you can do it, but if it's a bit weird, it might not actually be an enjoyable experience either for the listener or for the player. So I feel like certain instruments teach you certain things about music that maybe beforehand weren't so important in a practice, and articulation. Yeah,
you mentioned New Simplicity, and that for you perhaps not every little detail counts. I realize as well that some composers, for some, it's really important for like the specificity. Um, but I'm curious, do you think that what, to put it, what makes or breaks the piece? If it's not that, is it something else then? Something on the macro of the piece, like perhaps the structure that you mentioned? Because in my experience as an instrumentalist, uh, if it's not that, it's something else where you really, where the specificity is actually high, but it might not be uh, those details, but it's perhaps the synthesis of the sound together, or it's let's say dynamics, or what would be that? Do you think there's something for you that you really really know? It's have a specific idea.
Probably structure.
Structure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I feel like I obsess over structure a bit too much, and that probably is the indicator that that's the thing I'm usually most interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to think a lot about structure before I can even start writing a piece.
Right.
Um, and quite often I'll think about it and it changes, and that's fine, but I need to think about it, you know. Um, and there may be certain sonic features that become structure, and so those sonic features do get a lot of specificity. Um, but that's because I'm thinking about them on this arch. I'm not necessarily thinking like, well, it has to be this sound for this particular second, you know.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I feel like in any practice, there's always, as you say, like there's always going to be some level of specificity somewhere. Um, for me, I think it's structure, and I do think in a macro scale because I'm even. I remember a few years ago I mentioned affect theory, and I still think about affect theory. I'm using it a lot at the minute, um, and
What
I
is that?
really
If you can refresh my memory. And for everyone that never heard about it or never listens to you speak.
yeah, affect. This is like a can of worms. Pandora's box is now opened. Um, so affect, depending on where you situate it, is either a system of thinking about like moods of a piece you can think of. So in the 17th century, in an 18th century, they were thinking about affect in lyra, and so each piece would have a particular mood, and this was often dictated by a key. And that mood, you know, E flat major would have one type of affect, A flat major would have another type of affect.
Okay, right. Okay.
But as affect has sort of shifted and changed, especially in the cultural turn of the 1980s, there's a lot of theory that has emerged, and it's kind of, I suppose the most straightforward way of explaining it is it's a theory of feeling. Um, and there's loads of people who are writing about it who are from different strands of thought. Some go back to Deleuze or Spinoza. Some take other directions. I'm very much interested in the Spinoza thread with and Deleuze, um, and thinking about the ways a piece can create an environment of feeling. And that's not to be like music psychology, I'm going to control what you're feeling kind of thing, but like just understanding that the piece has that potential to open up what could be lots of different affects, or it could be one type of affect, or again just replace affect with feeling theory, or emotion theory, you know. And that I feel is where structure is super important. I went to an organ concert last night, and there's this one moment where I'm not a big fan of like super super loud organ, and this was a super super loud organ moment.
Okay.
But that being said, it was amazing. Like it you felt like the whole world had just opened up at this moment of the all the stops were out, you know. Um, and it was because the way that the piece was structured in this sort of amoeba of movement that suddenly everything became clear. And I think if it didn't have that, the piece wouldn't have been particularly interesting. It would have just been an amoeba, which sometimes can be interesting, but I feel like the structural point of having that clarified what kind of piece it was, and that was an affect. I wouldn't necessarily say what kind of affect, but it was an affect, and it made the whole piece amazing, even though it was just that one moment that did that.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that's where I think structure for me is really important, because it's like, well, structure can not dictate, that's the wrong word. You can go on a journey with structure in the same way that I don't think you can, unless you're using specificities of a performance technique structurally, I don't think that takes you on that journey, personally. So yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because sometimes today it seems like it's almost a taboo topic to say that there's a feeling or expression present, but as you said, there's very different types of composition happening and thinking of composition. And also for me, in thoughts, it's sometimes it doesn't make sense to really ascribe that too much. But on the other hand, there's just if not else historical music, and perhaps also intuition based on listening to that music, that you cannot help yourself but to hear something as sad or something as happy or something as funny. And so then I wonder, is it simply a lack of better words that we as composers then go for expression or a feeling or an emotion, because in a sense it's always a bodily experience listening to the sound, and maybe that's simply the closest you can get to without when thinking of that experience. Apart from speaking about vibration, good or bad vibration, I'm using these two terms a bit, humorously, but also as helpful. So yeah, let's say to continue with your structure, with your work on structure. And since we are now speaking of music and of composition, I would like to bring on the titles you were already mentioning. Let's say in connection to titles, what are you trying to achieve when working with structure? Is there something that guides you there? Or another way, any way to further clarify perhaps the work on structure, since you pointed it out as, let's say, one of the cardinal aspects of your compositional work.
Yeah, I think every piece has a different goal, but structure helps achieve it, is maybe one way of thinking of it.
Can be also on a specific piece, so you don't have to generalize, perhaps. Whatever is more close to you.
I think sometimes structure becomes about synthesis. I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot recently, where obviously the term composer just literally means to put together. And so, like, what happens when you put like 10 different things in a piece? Like, we're taught, I think the majority of us are taught, like, no, there's too many ideas, don't do that. But then what happens when you do? I think that's an interesting question. What happens when, the 20th century was kind of two narratives of structure. One was like have everything, and the other was like no, just have one chord, you know. And so you've got like obviously the avant-garde and minimalism running at the same time. Um, both are great, both are cool. I think with structure, sometimes it's what I have to think about what is this piece about, and then I can start to think about structure. And so sometimes, so I just had a piece performed. It's called Heart of Matter, and it's a piece for percussion ensemble and a hidden narrator, and it has like 9 movements. But I wasn't thinking of them as movements. I was just thinking of them as flows, like one thing to the next. Um, it was because I think when we think in movements, usually it's like this is a nice self-contained thing. This is another nice self-contained thing, and I wasn't thinking of it that way. It's in 9 sections maybe, but they all have a different name.
You could not just take one or three and perform them apart, perhaps.
Exactly, yeah. It would have to be the entire thing. And it's a theatre piece. There's people who are wrapped in that, like they're in ponchos, they're wrapping up instruments in bubble wrap, they're blowing bubbles, but they're also playing their instruments as percussionists. And I was obsessing over the structure of this. I was like, well, where do these things go? And so there is a moment where so there's 10 percussionists and 3 people come forwards, and they do a big dramatic breath, and then they start blowing bubbles into water. This is just after a big percussion, 10 people have just been playing really loudly, very densely, and then they just come forward and do that. And so I'm interested in these juxtapositions that create theatre, that create questions, that create ways of challenging listening, I suppose, because it's quite different to go from actual percussion ensemble to someone blowing bubbles. It's like, what's happening? And so I think theatre and structure become an interesting thing for me. I had a conversation with my partner last night at this organ concert, and they were saying that they find it much easier to close their eyes and then listen, because it drowns out all the visuals. And I was thinking, actually, I think of music quite visually. I'm not synesthetic, but I do think of music quite visually. And so structure becomes architecture. And so I think about when I visit a building I love, like what is the affect of that building? How does it make me feel? Even though I'm from Birmingham in the UK, which the architecture is like beautiful 19th century building, really ugly brutalist building. I love brutalism still, but like visually it's quite aggressive, And then you've got like a modern building next to it, and it's like, what is happening? It's cool. It's cool, but it's also like really juxtaposed, and so it creates a new type of affect, or feeling or emotion, whatever you want to call it. And so I think about music that way. I think like, what can music do to provoke or to encourage types of listening, or how can bringing things together that don't usually go together create a new type of affect? And so in this percussion piece, that operates by having these juxtapositions of very loud percussion ensemble, small theatrical moment, then a synthesis of percussion ensemble with with a narrator on top, that then transitions to something else. And so it's always morphological with materials that somehow come together, even though they are not related. And that interests me. I also think I start every piece going, I'm going to just do one thing in this piece, and I never do one thing. I'm just like,
yes.
Because I think there are so many interesting things to do. So it's structure. I suppose structure becomes a way of containing that. So structure is a container for all these things that I've spoken about that I enjoy,
Mhm.
um, it acts as a container to not let it get too wild. And
Mhm.
I think that's why structure is so important to how I think.
Yeah, yeah. So basically, uh, you're, if I understand correct, you're developing through composition, or maybe innovating a way to fire a new affect. Uh, if I understood, because you said something that you don't know yet, something that it will, it, it will arise from putting all this perhaps unconventional
Mm,
together
mm.
parts together. Um, is well, what about humor there? Especially when you were mentioning the bubbles, is this something you consider? If I would see that, I would probably really laugh. Not to be disrespectful,
No,
but
no, no.
just this is what would probably happen. Do you consider humor also being a part of? Yes.
I love humor. I sometimes I always find with pieces that are, especially musical pieces that use theatre, um, or gesture of some sort. I think it's very dangerous to forcefully be humorous. Um, but I think there are moments that some people can laugh at and should laugh at if they feel they want to. Um, and I love those moments. I like if someone is going to laugh at something in a piece, go for it. That is if it's there and you're laughing, great. Um, because yeah, it's humorous. Like, why are three people blowing bubbles at the front of the stage? Like, that's what. Um, but it's more in the perplexity of it that it becomes humorous, rather than this is meant to be a funny moment.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I
Perplexity is
enjoy
a great
I
term.
I enjoy that a bit more than purposefully being funny.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm,
I
mhm,
have another piece for brass quintet that 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 was received really well, and lots of people found it very humorous.
mhm.
Um, and yeah, that I love the fact people laughed.
I
And
guess
so like
it's the British humor again, huh? Yeah. Great. All right. So perhaps towards the conclusion already. Um, Anything about the future? Uh, what are you aspiring to to see to do in compositional practice in the future?
that's a big question. Um,
Sorry.
in the immediate now future, I am currently working on a project that is a collaboration with a scientist and a dancer, and so and this I feel is building on the essence of where I want to go with things, is like have more collaborative relationships, um, and this is about kelp and kelp growth and the kelp forest in Northern California. Um, but even though it's very much like I am the composer doing the composery things, the population scientist is doing their thing, and the dancers doing their thing. I think just the act of collaborating has become an exciting space for me. I had some work done previously where I was working with a librettist and a director, and that was really exciting. And then this percussion piece, again, there was all this collaboration involved, and there was lighting, and um, the players had their own interpretations and stuff. So I think I'm currently in the really exciting space of trying to push my work in a direction that is more collaborative. Um, and I think all these things that I'm interested in will kind of just tail along with me in these collaborations. Um, and so the direction of process is more now like a practical or logistical thing as opposed to an aesthetic. I feel like I've accumulated all the aesthetic things I'm interested in, and now it's a practical concern of like who are the people I can collaborate with for the future. Um, that's what's most exciting.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Okay, so now just for the end, I always ask my guests for two messages. One for any aspiring composers, and the other one for any future listeners of your work, if you would care to share.
Sure. Again, more profound questions. Um, uh, any aspiring composers? Um, I think the world of training in composition involves a lot of opinions and a lot of people saying what they think is right and what they think is wrong. And this can happen with listeners, it can happen with other composers, it can happen with teachers, musicians. And I think you should be a sponge and absorb it all, but you should also not let any of it influence you. You should learn from it, but you should also resist the idea that someone else's opinion can influence your work. Find the things that you love, that you're interested in, that make you happy, that you can express, that only you can express, and really find a way to embrace that, regardless of what other people are saying. But be daring. If you found things that you enjoy, find ways of also pushing those. Experiment, explore. I think that's the for aspiring composers. Future listeners, also viewers, because I feel like I do a lot of theatre stuff too. Maybe it's a similar thing. Come with open ears and open eyes. I think I very much try to make each piece a bit different. And so if you've ever heard anything before, the next piece might be very different to that. And so don't have expectations, but be open to the possibility of anything. I write music with not for the purpose of catering to audiences, but with the audience in mind. I'm interested in how audiences feel and think and go through a space of listening and performance. And so there's care that goes into that, and I hope there's a care of listening that meets it too. Yeah.
Max Gibson, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Neža.